After the success of the original Spyro trilogy, Insomniac was ready to move away from the IP. From 1998 to 2000, they worked solely on the series, pouring their hearts into every title along with any ideas they could come up with, and by the release of the third game, their longing to move on to new projects was beginning to show, and as such, they promptly parted ways with the Dragon. This led to the creation of new IPs like Ratchet & Clank, Resistance, Sunset Overdrive, and even the new Spider-Man game that everyone's going wild about. Without a sole developer to produce games, Spyro just sort of drifted around from company to company. You know what happened. First the series went multi-platform, then spawned 2 new spin-off trilogies, and somehow in 2018 is returning back to the way it was 2 decades ago. What I'm betting you didn't know is that there was yet another Spyro trilogy on the Game Boy Advance, except I'm sure you knew that already because, let's be honest, it wasn't much of a secret. Yes, sometime after Insomniac's departure, the IP was handed to Digital Eclipse, and in 2001, Spyro Season of Ice was released for the Game Boy Advance, meaning this is technically Spyro 4. You're looking at it, people, this is the true continuation of Spyro 3's narrative. Trust me, at this point I'll take any opportunity I can to diminish Enter the Dragonfly's worth. On that note, were you aware that back in 2007, a New York mother filed a lawsuit against Sony and the makers of the game, claiming that it gave her epileptic child a grand mal seizure? Subscribe to Calcom for more Were You Aware video games, to be the first to hear actually interesting trivia told by someone who isn't a piece of cardboard. Spyro Season of Ice begins with Spyro, Hunter, and Bianca enjoying a day at the beach, until the trio receives a letter from Zoe, informing them that someone has cast a spell over the fairy world, trapping all of the fairies in ice. Adding to the madness, the place is also running wild with Rhinox, because, you know, Year of the Dragon was the last game to come out, and new ideas are just a bit too difficult to come up with. To make matters even worse, Bianca realizes that her spellbook, which could prove useful in fixing everything, is suddenly missing. Ever the heroic one, Spyro decides that there's little time to waste, and the trio sets out to save the day. It turns out that the cause of all the problems is a boneheaded Rhinox named Grindor, who stole the sorceress's spellbook from Bianca in an attempt to make himself more intelligent, only for his plan to backfire, giving him 2 heads and 4 headaches. I know the feeling. So, being a title on the GBA, which albeit was admittedly impressive when it came to handling full 3D, the game plays as an isometric platformer, much in the vein of Super Mario RPG and Sonic 3D Blast. While limited, the graphics are what you'd expect from a Spyro game, ultra colorful and just really nice to look at despite their simplicity. Digital Eclipse spent a lot of time on making the visuals look their best, and that's something that remains consistent through their whole trilogy. In a surprising twist, the music was composed by Robert Baffy and Ed Kazuko, with Baffy himself taking sole control later in the trilogy, marking this as the first game in the entire series where Stuart Copeland didn't handle the soundtrack. Obviously, the Game Boy Advance and PlayStation were 2 very different pieces of hardware, and Copeland enjoyed making use of his own samples in his work, so it makes sense that someone else took over for the almost bit-crushed chiptune soundtrack. I wouldn't exactly say that the songs are very Spyro-y, it takes a certain composer to do that, like Copeland himself. Instead, they're more in a league of their own, fitting right in with the isometric presentation. The gameplay is pretty much what you'd expect by this point from a Spyro game. You explore a plethora of enchanted levels whilst collecting enough MacGuffins to progress from homeworld to homeworld. This time around, you're rescuing fairies that have been encased in ice crystals, as well as collecting the series' trademark gems, excluding the purple ones worth 25. Overall, Spyro controls well enough, never handling too loose or stiff, and also retains his ability to charge, breathe fire, and glide. I gotta say, the biggest problem here is just the camera. It's a bit too zoomed in on Spyro himself, and most of the time there's not enough space to see what's in front of you. Sure, you can hold down the L button to get a better view of things, but this just barely mitigates the issue as it's still prominent otherwise. The isometric viewpoint is no help either. The lack of any real depth perception or emphasis on changes in geometry are a one-way ticket to cheap deaths, clearing out your lives in no time flat only for you to be suddenly greeted by a game over. And it's not like the lives are plentiful either. They were really stingy with the one-ups here to the point of where you never have enough. The worst part is, dying sees you lose your progress towards in-level objectives. Remember, you're saving fairies here, and the brunt of them are rescued by completing arbitrary tasks, like lighting things on fire or destroying certain objects. It doesn't matter if you're one away from being done. If you die, all of your progress goes down the toilet, which is incredibly infuriating since most of these levels are nothing short of labyrinthian, and without a map, you'll be hard-pressed to remember exactly where you've been and where you need to be. To add even further insult to injury, none of the levels have checkpoints. You know, usually you'd reach the midpoint and Zoe would zap you, but no, there is none of that here, and it sadly leads to the game feeling unforgiving as dying sees you respawn all the way back at the beginning of a level, leaving you to trek across an empty plane. Not everything is limited to just isometric Spyro gameplay though, as speedways return along with Sparks levels, a la Spyro 3. Surprisingly, these are a good fit for the handheld formula. The top-down shooter gameplay provides a nice change of pace from the collectathon business, but I'd be lying if I didn't say it played just a bit better in Spyro 3. Something about the control here feels off. I often found Sparks aiming the wrong way, never quite doing what I needed him to. Much like their console counterparts, the speedways see Spyro doing various things, flying through rings and destroying objects, all to gain time and gems, until finally coming up against a boss. All in all, Season of Ice is what you'd expect from Spyro's first handheld outing, competent enough to stand on its own, but still home to a whole slew of problems. There was definitely room for improvement, and it would soon come the next year in the form of Spyro 2 Season of Flame, not to be confused with Spyro 2 Riptos Rage. The game begins with the trio of Spyro, Hunter, and Bianca returning from their vacation, only to find that Rhinox have now seized the Dragon Realms, stealing all of its resident fireflies, therefore causing the world's magic to up and vanish, resulting in none of the dragons, Spyro included, being able to breathe fire. It's pretty much what would happen if you took the whole shtick from Frozen Altars and made it a plot point. I'm banking on the idea that someone at Digital Eclipse really enjoyed that level. It's essentially a race against time, with the looming threat of the dragons having to flee due to plummeting temperatures, though thankfully there's no in-game timer, it's purely plot related. You eventually find out that the main culprit is none other than Ripto, which I'm not even gonna question because Spyro 3's epilogue makes it clear that he survived a swim in liquid hot magma. I'm also not gonna question why Ripto commands legions of Rhinox when he should instead be in charge of Riptos, because this game actually came out before its bastardized console sibling. Presentation-wise, it's nearly identical to Season of Ice, which is by no means a bad thing. In fact, most of its improvements come in the form of how the game plays, as well as the various level designs. For starters, levels actually have checkpoints this time around, meaning if you die while in the middle of completing objectives, there's no bullshit consequence as nothing is reset. Levels have also been tweaked to better compensate the isometric gameplay, with very few jumps bordering on leap of faith territory, and while there were a few deaths here or there, I'd be lying if I didn't say there was a noticeable improvement in the platforming. Easily the most useful of these fixes and additions is the added factor of being able to view the map of whatever level you're in by simply pressing the L button and select simultaneously. It goes without saying, but this allows you to get a bearing on where you are and pretty much stomps out the maze-like design issue. Spyro is also subject to receiving various upgrades over the course of the game, namely a more powerful charge maneuver that allows him to break certain objects, as well as a few different breath abilities. The core gameplay remains relatively untouched, except this time you're collecting fireflies by freezing them instead of saving fairies by melting their icy prisons. This is also the first... What the hell is this? This is also the first GBA Spyro game to officially reintroduce the 25 value gem, though it's now colored blue and resembles that of a, I don't know, piece of corn. It kinda looks like those gold jewels from Rayman 3. In addition to the regular levels, this time around also sees you controlling both Sheila the Kangaroo and Agent 9 the Monkey in their own respective stages, replacing the Speedways and Sparks missions from before. Sheila's gameplay is close to Spyro's in its isometric presentation, however, plays very similar to a game of Q*bert, operating on a sort of grid that sees Sheila hopping from square to square, and even incorporates a bit of strategy into the mix as you have to work out ways to take down enemies, while on the flip side, Agent 9's stages are very much 2D run-and-gun side-scrollers. Overall, Season of Flame pretty much righted all of the wrongs set in place by Season of Ice, and I'd even go as far as saying, if you're looking to play either of the games, skip straight to this one. However, if neither of these have managed to capture your attention, look no further than the final piece of the trilogy released just the next year, Spyro Attack of the Rhinox. Because Rhinox haven't been the main villains over the course of the previous two games. Now they're really attacking! This one begins with Spyro and Sparks visiting the professor's laboratory, as he showcases to the two an invention that'll allow Ripto to be spied on. Alright, let me just stop things here. How many games does Ripto have to be the main villain? Like, I get it, he's easily Spyro's most eccentric nemesis, I guess because he verbally stated that he hates dragons, but was there really no other bad guy they could have used? Season of Ice might have been a janky start, but at least Grindor, while being a Rhinox, was original and actually proved to be different than Nasty Nork, Ripto, and the Sorceress. Was there really a demand for Ripto to keep coming back? You'd have thought the previous console game would have been enough to brutally murder him, but I suppose that's been proven wrong. So yeah, due to a number of circumstances, Ripto escapes and unleashes his Rhinox into the world, thus beginning the journey. Of the three games, this one is the furthest removed, as instead of a linear level-to-level process, it falls more in line with an RPG title and plays as an open-world platformer, kind of like how A Hero's Tale did things, which is admittedly cool. Instead of entering portals and completing objectives within sanctioned-off levels, you instead explore a multitude of lands, all connected by one big hub area, and are assigned quests by various NPCs. It never gets to be anything more than finding a number of themed items like toys, plants, or metals, and thankfully fits right into the Spyro formula of collecting stuff to progress. The brunt of these are gained by completing a diverse set of challenges, though they can also be found inside of colored chests. Completing a set of collectibles, and therefore completing a quest, nets you hearts. Not actual hearts, more like special items in the vein of talismans from Ripto's Rage, essential to completing the game and stopping Ripto. Much like before, Spyro also gains new skills, like upgrades to increase the power behind his breath abilities, an extra hit point for Sparks, and even head bashing to name a few. These all play into the game's more than copious amounts of backtracking, which, while not overly strenuous, assist in furthering the game from its predecessors. This ain't your level-to-level Spyro, this is a fully fledged adventure title. Within each area are air vents, which see Sparks traveling inside to find either Agent 9 or Sergeant Bird. Again, these act to break up the gameplay from time to time. Similarly to Season of Flame, Agent 9's levels are yet again 2D side-scrollers. However, instead of fast-paced action, things are relatively slowed down, as stealth is of the essence, as you take down Rhinox from behind, while also collecting keys and saving other agents. It might be the stealth lover in me, but I actually enjoyed these a fair bit, and while there are definitely a few frustrating moments here and there, I'd go as far as saying I prefer these to the running and gunning sections from the last game. Sergeant Bird's levels are more or less identical to those seen within Year of the Dragon, furiously tapping the A button to make him fly and blasting enemies with rockets while saving other soldiers. I think it's safe to say that overall, this is easily the best rounded of the three games, if a little too easy. The added factor of checkpoints in Season of Flame was enough to snuff out most of the difficulty, but here there's really no stipulation for dying because, for some reason, lives just don't exist in this game, probably to fit in with the open world RPG theme. Following Attack of the Rhinox release, it was high time for things to change. Both Crash and Spyro, two series subject to mediocre sales during the early years of the 6th gen, were shaping up to become big names again, with the soon-to-be concurrent releases of both Crash Twinsanity and Spyro A Hero's Tale. As such, it was time for the Game Boy Advance to get in on the action, and development for a new Spyro game was handed to Vicarious Visions, who were also working on a new Crash game for the system. This resulted in a product that can only be described as the most ill-fated team-up of all time. Crash Bandicoot Purple, Ripto's Rampage, and Spyro Orange, The Cortex Conspiracy, two crossover games that saw a simultaneous release on June 3rd of 2004. The title is Spyro Game Boy Advance games, and as such, my main focus is gonna be on Spyro Orange. Time will tell if I ever delve into the pit that is GBA Crash games. Now, you've probably heard a lot of people talk about this game. In fact, if you've never heard of any of the other three, you've most likely at least heard of this one. And before I begin things, I just want to preface that yes, this game is bad. but it is by no means the worst thing ever created. Sure, it's no Attack of the Rhinox, or Season of Flame, or even Season of Ice for that matter, but at the end of the day, it's harmless. So the story begins with who other than Ripto teaming up with Dr. Cortex, as the two deduce that working together will make them unstoppable against either foe. Spoiler alert, no. And as you've probably guessed by now, both Crash and Spyro team up. The gameplay of this one is, how do you say, confused. See, it initially presents itself as a 2D platformer, which, going off of ideas alone, could have worked. Sure, the signature Spyro gameplay revolving around exploration and discovery would have been entirely absent, but think about it this way, Spyro was already dead at this point. However, the core gameplay actually revolves around playing a series of minigames, a la Mario Party, except they're all single player and there's only a few types of them before they start to repeat. As you've probably guessed, the 2D side-scrolling is reserved only for the hub areas and really offers nothing to the gameplay except for getting around, which is admittedly disappointing. Fitting right in with the disappointment is the mini-games. Now you're probably expecting me to go full-on angry gamer and be completely unoriginal, which is apparently something I do, but instead of playing these and becoming filled with annoyance and rage, I instead found mediocrity. You know, it's one thing to play a game that's bad and also unbearable, but to play a game that's bad with no personality whatsoever is even worse. These minigames are so incredibly bland with nothing to be said about them, and you can't help but feel bad for this game as a whole, because no matter how much of a bastardization it is, it's still technically a Spyro game. That being said, it's a bad one. You know, how does the old saying go? I believe it's forgive and forget. Well, what say we forgive Vicarious Visions and forget this entire crossover ever happened?